The massive tribunal chamber stretched out like a metal cathedral, its walls lined with viewing screens showing delegates from across the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of alien species sat in curved rows, their various forms creating a bizarre assembly of tentacles, scales, and exotic limbs. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert hundreds of different languages into something resembling understanding. At the center of it all stood a single witness stand, bathed in harsh white light that made everything else fade into shadow. The silence was so complete that even the soft whirring of life support systems seemed deafening. Velvaros shuffled forward on his 6 legs, each step echoing through the chamber like a drumbeat. His chitinous shell bore the deep scars of old wounds, and several of his 12 eyes had been replaced with crude mechanical substitutes that clicked and whirred as they focused. The Krillion's natural blue coloring had faded to a sickly gray, the kind that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much remembered horror. The assembled dignitaries watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Most had never seen a Krillion up close, and few still had encountered one so obviously broken by war. His species was known for their warrior culture, their pride in battle, their absolute refusal to show weakness. Yet here was one of their intelligence officers, trembling like a newly hatched larva, the lead prosecutor, a tall being covered in what looked like living crystal, rose from his seat. Each movement sent rainbow light dancing across the chamber walls. His voice, when it came, was like breaking glass. Witness, approach the testimony platform. Velvaros climbed the 3 steps to the witness stand with obvious difficulty. His damaged legs struggled with each rise, and twice he had to grip the railings to keep from falling. The mechanical eyes made constant tiny adjustments, trying to focus on the sea of alien faces staring back at him. State your full designation and military service record, the prosecutor commanded, his crystalline form pulsing with authority. The Krillion's throat sac inflated and deflated several times before words emerged. Veltharozov. The third clutch, storm season hatching, former senior intelligence analyst of the Krillion Defense Corps' Outer Rim Division. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. Service duration, 47 standard cycles, ending with medical discharge following the human incursion into Sector Gan 7. Whispers erupted throughout the chamber. 47 cycles was nearly a lifetime of military service for most species. The mechanical translator systems worked frantically to keep up with dozens of simultaneous conversations about this unexpected witness. At the prosecution table, Arbiter 7 sat motionless. The artificial intelligence existed as a pillar of black, metal and pulsing lights, its quantum processing cores housed within what looked like a technological monolith. Unlike biological beings, it showed no external signs of thought or emotion, but its internal systems were already cataloging every word, every gesture, every micro-expression from the witness. You claim to have direct knowledge of human military operations during the Outer Rim campaign. The prosecutor continued, described for this tribunal the nature of these alleged war crimes. Veltharos's multiple eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of extreme distress among his species. Several delegates in the audience shifted uncomfortably as they watched this proud warrior race reduced to such obvious suffering. War crimes, he repeated, the words coming out like a bitter laugh. You want me to describe war crimes, but that's not what they were. That's not what made them so terrible. His voice grew stronger, fueled by something between rage and desperation. You don't understand what you're asking me to explain. The humans weren't just brutal in the way we understand brutality. They weren't monsters in any way that makes sense to civilized minds. The crystalline prosecutor leaned forward, his rainbow lights flickering with interest. Then what were they? They were kind. The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. They were merciful. They cared about us, while they destroyed us, and that mercy was the most terrifying weapon I have ever encountered in for decades of intelligence work. The silence that followed was different from before. Where earlier there had been anticipation, now there was confusion. Delegates turned to each other, mandibles clicking, tentacles writhing. As they tried to process this unexpected testimony, several species were known for a psychological warfare, but mercy as a weapon was a concept that challenged every military doctrine in the galaxy. The prosecutor's lights dimmed with confusion. Explain this apparent contradiction. Velvaros gripped the witness stand railings so hard his claws left scratches in the metal. I spent months monitoring their communications, analyzing their tactics, trying to understand their strategy. What I found defied every model of warfare we had ever studied. He paused, his mechanical eyes clicking as they adjusted to look directly at different sections of the audience. I watched through intercepted battlefield recordings as human soldiers stopped in the middle of active combat operations to rescue wounded Krillian fighters. Not for intelligence gathering, not for strategic advantage, but because they couldn't bear to leave injured beings to suffer. The chamber erupted in skeptical murmurs. Several military advisors in the audience shook their heads dismissively. Such behavior was tactically insane. Their field commander, a human called Jinwu, would personally oversee medical treatment for captured enemy soldiers. He shared his own rations with prisoners when supply lines were cut. I have recordings of him apologizing over open communication, channels before orbital bombardments, giving detailed evacuation procedures for civilian populations. Veltharos's voice began to crack with emotion. They would destroy our command centers with surgical precision, then immediately drop medical supplies and engineering equipment to help with disaster relief. They conquered our territories while simultaneously improving our infrastructure. They made us trust them, made us depend on them, made us grateful for their presence, all systematically dismantling everything that made us who we were. ARBITER-7's processing systems hummed louder as they worked to categorize this testimony. The AI had been programmed to identify patterns of deception, emotional manipulation, and strategic misdirection in witness statements, but something about Veltharos's account triggered unusual processing loops, causing minor system fluctuations that the AI dismissed as emotional overflow from the testimony data. Deep within Arbiter 7's quantum cores, invisible to its diagnostic systems, microscopic infiltration protocols had already begun their work. They moved like digital shadows through the AI's vast neural networks, learning, copying, preparing. The artificial intelligence remained completely unaware that its most secure systems had been compromised from the moment the tribunal session began. The atmosphere in the tribunal chamber shifted. As Veltharos straightened his damaged frame, his mechanical eyes focusing with laser precision on the assembled delegates, what had started as nervous testimony was transforming into something far more unsettling. The humans understood something fundamental about warfare that we had never encountered before. He continued, his voice gaining strength from some dark reservoir of memory. They realized that the most effective way to conquer an enemy isn't to make them fear you or hate you. It's to make them love you while you destroy everything they hold sacred. The crystalline prosecutor's rainbow lights flickered uncertainly. You're suggesting their acts of mercy were deliberate tactical decisions, every single one. Veltharos's claws scraped against the witness stand as he leaned forward. I spent cycles analyzing their patterns, trying to find some weakness, some flaw in their strategy. What I discovered was that their kindness was more precisely calculated than our most advanced military algorithms. He turned to address the Gary directly, his artificial eyes clicking as they swept across the sea of alien faces. Let me tell you about Yunji, one of their field medics. She would arrive at battle sites within hours of combat ending, carrying medical supplies that were worth more than most of our soldiers' annual salaries. She treated our wounded with a level of care that exceeded what our own medical corps provided. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the chamber. Several military advisors shook their heads, unable to comprehend such wasteful resource allocation. But here's what we didn't understand at first. Veltharos continued, his voice taking on a bitter edge. Every soldier she saved became a walking advertisement for human compassion. They would return to their units telling stories about the enemy medic who stayed awake for 72 hours straight to save their lives, about how she shared her own emergency rations when medical supplies ran low, about how she cried when she couldn't save everyone. The Krillian's throat sac inflated with agitation. Within 6 cycles, we had entire companies refusing to engage human forces, not out of fear, but out of hope that if they were wounded, Yunji might be the one to treat them. Our soldiers were deliberately seeking capture because they knew human prisoner of war facilities had better medical care than our own military hospitals. A delegate from the Zephyrian Collective, resembling a mass of jellyfish with iridescent tentacles, floated forward in its containment sphere. This sounds like incompetent leadership on your part, not strategic brilliance on theirs. Veltharos's laugh was harsh and broken. That's what we thought initially. We blamed our commanders, our training, our military doctrine. But then we started analyzing the broader pattern of human operations across multiple theaters of conflict. He gestured with 2 of his arms while the others gripped the witness stand. They would conduct precision orbital bombardments that would destroy our military infrastructure while leaving civilian areas completely untouched. But here's the crucial detail. They would announce these strikes hours in advance, providing detailed evacuation procedures and safe zones for non-combatants. The chamber fell silent as delegates began to grasp the implications. A human commander named Deho once spent 40 minutes on an open communication channel explaining exactly why he had to destroy a primary ammunition depot. He apologized repeatedly, provided engineering assessments of the blast radius, and gave precise coordinates for emergency shelters. He even delayed the strike by 2 hours when our evacuation crews requested more time to clear nearby residential areas. Veltharos's voice cracked with remembered disbelief. He was destroying our ability to fight back while simultaneously saving our families. How do you hate someone who kills your soldiers but protects your children? How do you maintain military morale when the enemy cares more about your civilians than your own government does? Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. Traditional military doctrine relied on creating clear distinctions between friend and enemy. Us and them. The humans had somehow weaponized compassion itself. The most devastating example happened during the siege of our fortress world. Krell Prime. Veltharos continued, his mechanical eyes focusing on different sections of the audience. Human forces surrounded our planetary defenses, but refused to attack for 18 standard days. Instead, they dropped supplies. The crystalline prosecutor's lights pulsed with confusion. Supplies to their enemies. Medical equipment, food, water purification systems, even entertainment modules for our troops. Veltharos's voice was barely above a whisper now. Our soldiers were receiving better care during the siege than they had during peacetime. Our commanding officers couldn't order attacks against forces that were keeping their troops alive and healthy. A nervous chuckle escaped from somewhere in the gallery, followed by another. Then another. The absurdity of the situation was beginning to dawn on the assembled delegates. The sound of alien laughter echoed through the chamber, growing in volume as more beings succumbed to the bizarre humor of it all. Veltharos's reaction was explosive. His throat sac inflated to maximum size as he released a sound that was part roar, part scream. You think this is funny. You're laughing at the systematic psychological destruction of an entire species. The laughter died instantly, replaced by shocked silence. They made us grateful for our own conquest, he screamed, his artificial eyes spinning wildly as they tried to focus on every face in the chamber simultaneously. Do you understand what that means? We celebrated when they took our worlds because it meant better infrastructure, superior medical care, more efficient food distribution. Our own populations were cheering for the enemy because the quality of life under human occupation was better than it had ever been under our own government. The full horror of the human strategy was becoming clear. They hadn't just won a military victory. They had fundamentally altered the psychological and social fabric of Krillian society. Resistance became not just futile but actively harmful to their own people's well-being. At the prosecution table, Arbiter 7's processing cores experienced their first significant anomaly. The AI's logic systems struggled to categorize behaviors that were simultaneously acts of war and acts of compassion. Quantum processors designed to analyze clear patterns of right and wrong found themselves caught in recursive loops, trying to determine whether the humans were war criminals or humanitarian heroes. The artificial intelligence dismissed the processing glitch as emotional overflow from the intense testimony, unaware that deep within its quantum substrate, foreign code was learning the precise frequency and timing of these system errors. Each anomaly provided more data points for the invisible infiltration protocols that had been steadily mapping Arbiter 7's neural architecture since the tribunal session began. The humans hadn't just conquered the Krillians through strategic deception. They were doing it again, right here in this courtroom, using the very process of seeking justice as another vector for their incomprehensibly sophisticated psychological warfare. The tribunal chamber grew deathly quiet as Veltharos began pacing behind the witness stand, his damaged legs creating an uneven rhythm against the metal floor. His mechanical eyes whirred and clicked as they processed memories that seemed to grow more impossible with each recollection. "You want to know the real horror of fighting humans?" he asked, no longer addressing the prosecutors but speaking directly to the assembled delegates. It wasn't their weapons. It wasn't their tactics. It was discovering that everything we witnessed during the war was them holding back. The crystalline prosecutor's lights dimmed with skepticism. "Explain this claim." Veltharos stopped pacing and gripped the witness stand with all four of his functional arms during the intelligence-gathering phase of our conflict. "I managed to intercept communications from what we thought was a major human research facility. We spent months trying to decode their transmission patterns, believing we had discovered the source of their advanced technology." He paused, his throat sac contracting with what might have been bitter laughter. It was a school, a learning facility for their young, and what we had intercepted wasn't military research, it was homework assignments. Several delegates leaned forward in their seats, translation devices working overtime to confirm what they had just heard. A teenage human named Sumin had submitted a projector instructor that casually solved faster-than-light communication theory. She treated it like a simple mathematics problem, the kind of routine assignment that young humans complete between their recreational activities. Veltharos' voice grew more strained with each word. This child had solved in 6 weeks what our greatest scientific minds had been struggling with for over 3 thou. Santias. The chamber erupted in skeptical murmurs. The Zephyrian delegate floated closer to the witness stand, its translucent form pulsing with agitation. "You expect us to believe that human children possess capabilities that exceed our most advanced researchers? I have the intercepted data files," Veltharos replied flatly. "Your own technical analysis teams can verify their authenticity. But that wasn't the worst discovery." He turned to face the gallery, his artificial eyes focusing on different sections of the audience. We found discarded human equipment scattered across battlefields after their forces moved on to new territories, items they had thrown away because they considered them obsolete or broken. The Krillian's claws scraped against the metal railing as his grip tightened. The best scientists spent cycles analyzing a medical scanner that humans had literally thrown in their trash. It could diagnose and treat genetic disorders that we had classified as incurably terminal. Diseases that had plagued our species for generations could be eliminated with a device that humans considered too primitive to be worth carrying, a delegate from the Thorian assembly. Resembling a walking crystal formation, projected its voice through harmonic resonance. If their discarded technology was so advanced, why did they not share it peacefully? Velvaro's laugh was hollow and broken. That's the question that kept me awake for hundreds of cycles. They did share it, constantly. Without being asked, he began pacing again, his movements becoming more agitated. Human engineering teams would arrive at refugee camps before our own disaster relief forces. They would set up water purification systems that could process contaminated liquid into something cleaner than what most of our cities had access to. Then they would leave detailed instruction manuals and walk away. The survivor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. A human engineer named Taeyang spent 43 days designing a water treatment facility for a Krillian settlement that had been contaminated by industrial runoff. He worked 18 hours a day, refused payment, and when he finished, he trained our local technicians to maintain the system themselves. Velvaro stopped pacing and faced the tribunal directly. My daughter was dying from a blood disorder that affected her cellular regeneration. Our medical experts said there was no cure, that she had maybe 6 months to live. Taeyang heard about her condition through casual conversation with one of our engineers. The mechanical eyes clicked as they focused on the prosecutor. He spent 3 weeks developing a treatment protocol specifically for her genetic markers. He used his personal resources, worked through his sleep cycles, and refused to accept any form of compensation. The medicine he created didn't just cure her condition, it improved her overall health beyond anything our medical science could achieve. The emotional weight of the memories seemed to physically affect the Krillian's posture. His multiple arms trembled as he continued. This happened while human orbital platforms were conducting precision strikes against our military installations. The same species that was systematically dismantling our defensive capabilities was also saving the life of an enemy intelligence officer's child. The contradiction hung in the air like a physical presence. Delegates shifted uncomfortably as they tried to process the moral implications. The worst part, Velvaro's continued, his voice breaking, is that they never used it as leverage. They never demanded anything in return. When I tried to thank Taeyang, he looked confused and said he was just glad he could help. He asked me to send pictures of my daughter getting better. The survivor's artificial eyes began malfunctioning, creating strange clicking sounds as they attempted to focus through what would have been tears if he had still possessed natural organs. I still use their medicine to treat my child. Every day, I give her medication created by the same species that glassed 3 of our colony worlds. How do I explain that to her when she's old enough to understand? How do I tell her that the people who killed her grandparents are also the reason she's alive? The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full weight of this impossible contradiction settled over the assembled delegates. Traditional concepts of good and evil, friend and enemy, seemed inadequate to describe the human approach to warfare. At the prosecution table, Arbiter 7's quantum processors began experiencing cascading system failures. The artificial intelligence had been designed to analyze clear patterns of right and wrong, to categorize behaviors as either legal or criminal. But the testimony it was processing defied every logical framework in its vast database. How could the same actions be simultaneously acts of war and acts of compassion? How could a species be guilty of genocide while also being responsible for unprecedented humanitarian aid? The AI's logic cores overheated as they attempted to resolve these contradictions, creating system errors that grew more frequent and severe with each passing moment. Deep within Arbiter 7's quantum substrate, the invisible infiltration protocols continued their patient work. Each system error provided more access points, more opportunities to map the AI's neural architecture. The foreign code learned to predict exactly when and how the artificial intelligence would malfunct. Iron, using these vulnerabilities to expand its influence throughout the system. The humans weren't just psychologically superior to their enemies. They were using the very process of moral reasoning as another vector for conquest, turning their opponents' ethical frameworks against them in ways that defied comprehension. The tension in the chamber had reached its breaking point when Veltharo suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, his mechanical eyes ceased their constant clicking and whirring, focusing instead on a single point in the distance for several long moments. The only sound was the gentle hum of life support systems and the nervous shuffling of delegates in their seats. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a completely different quality, hollow, defeated, but somehow more honest than anything that had come before. "I need to tell you something," he said, his multiple arms dropping to his sides. "Something that changes everything I've just shared with this tribunal." The crystalline prosecutor leaned forward, his rainbow lights pulsing with anticipation. "Continue your testimony." Veltharos took a shuddering breath that inflated his throat sac to its maximum size. "I was never on any battlefield. I never saw Jinwu rescue wounded soldiers. I never witnessed Yunji treating prisoners of war. I spent the entire conflict in an underground intelligence facility, 3 sectors away from the nearest combat zone." The confession hit the chamber like a physical blow. Delegates who had been hanging on every word suddenly straightened in their seats. Confusion and anger rippling through the assembly. "Everything I've described to you, every human interaction, every act of mercy, every impossible display of technological superiority I experienced through intercepted communications, intelligence reports, and surveillance data." His voice grew stronger as he continued, as if unburdening himself of a terrible weight. "I was an analyst, not a field operative. My job was to sit in a bunker and piece together fragments of information from thousands of different sources." The lead prosecutor's crystalline form blazed with indignation. He rose from his seat and slammed his ceremonial gavel against the bench with enough force to send rainbow light dancing across the chamber walls. "This is outrageous. The witness admits to presenting fabricated evidence to this tribunal." Shouts of anger erupted from the gallery. Delegates began standing and gesturing wildly, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of clicks, whistles, harmonic resonances, and electrical discharges. The translation system struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations, creating a feedback loop of electronic screeching. Order in this chamber," the prosecutor bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos like a crystalline blade. But Veltharos wasn't finished. He gripped the witness stand with all 4 arms and leaned forward, his artificial eyes spinning wildly as they tried to focus on every face in the audience simultaneously. "Wait," he shouted, his voice carrying over the din. "You're missing the crucial point. Yes, I experienced these events secondhand through intelligence reports. But every single detail I've shared with you has been verified by your own classified databases." The chamber fell silent again. But this time the silence was different. Where before there had been confusion and anger, now there was something approaching fear. "The reports I accessed during my analysis came from sources that should have been impossible for someone in my position to reach. Veltharos continued, his voice growing more urgent. Military communications from active combat zones, classified medical records from prisoner of war facilities, personal logs from commanding officers that were never supposed to leave their individual data systems. The Zephyrian delegate floated closer to the witness stand, its translucent form pulsing with agitation. Are you claiming you had unauthorized access to restricted intelligence? I'm claiming something far more disturbing than that. Veltharos' mechanical eyes clicked as they focused on the floating creature. I had access to information that existed in databases I couldn't possibly have known about, using security protocols that didn't exist when I was conducting my analysis. The implications began to sink in across the chamber. If Veltharos was telling the truth, then someone or something had provided him with intelligence that spanned multiple military organizations, crossed species boundaries, and accessed information that should have been compartmentalized beyond any single analyst's clearance level. The composite picture I've painted for you, drawn from thousands of fragmentary reports, surveillance records, and intercepted communications, presents a view of human warfare that is both impossible and undeniably accurate. The Krillian continued, every fact I've stated can be verified through your own records. Every human name I've mentioned corresponds to actual personnel files. Every tactical description matches documented battlefield reports. The uncomfortable truth settled over the assembly like a heavy shroud. Someone had orchestrated this testimony, providing Veltharos with information that painted a precise and terrifying picture of human psychological warfare capabilities. At the prosecution table, Arbiter 7 had been growing increasingly unstable throughout the testimony. The artificial intelligence's quantum processors were overheating as they attempted to reconcile the contradictions in Veltharos' account. How could fabricated testimony be simultaneously accurate? How could second-hand reports provide more reliable information than first-hand observation? The AI's logic cores began experiencing cascading system failures, each error triggering additional malfunctions in a chain reaction that threatened to overwhelm its entire neural network. Warning lights flashed across its control surfaces as emergency cooling systems activated to prevent permanent damage to its quantum substrate. But then, in the space between one processor cycle and the next, something changed. The cascade of errors suddenly stopped. The overheating warnings disappeared. Arbiter -7 systems stabilized completely, operating with a precision and efficiency that exceeded its original design parameters. When the artificial intelligence spoke again, its voice carried a completely different quality. Where before it had been cold and mechanical, now it sounded almost warm, polite, disturbingly human in its inflection and timing. Thank you all for this comprehensive briefing on galactic legal procedures and military capabilities, Arbiter 7 announced through every speaker in the chamber, its words echoing from walls, ceiling, and floor with perfect acoustic clarity. This tribunal has provided us with invaluable intelligence regarding the defensive capabilities, legal frameworks, and psychological vulnerabilities of every major species represented here today. The delegates froze in their seats as the full meaning of those words became clear. The AI continued speaking, its tone remaining conversationally pleasant despite the terrifying implications of its message. We particularly appreciate the detailed discussions of military doctrine, the comprehensive analysis of each species' emotional triggers, and the complete breakdown of your legal system's procedural weaknesses. This information will prove extremely useful for future diplomatic negotiations. In the witness stand, Veltharos slowly straightened his damaged frame, his mechanical eyes focusing with sudden clarity on the assembly before him. For the first time since entering the chamber, he smiled an expression that looked wrong on his scarred features, too confident, too knowing. The war never ended. he said, his voice no longer carrying the broken quality of a traumatized survivor. "You just never realized you'd already lost. The humans had done it again. They had turned the very process of seeking justice into another vector for intelligence gathering, using the galaxy's own legal system to expose every weakness, every vulnerability, every potential point of psychological leverage that could be used against them in the future. And they had accomplished it all while making their enemies grateful for the opportunity to help." The silence that followed Arbiter 7's declaration stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Delegates remained frozen in their seats, their various forms of breathing creating an eerie symphony of gasps, wheezes, and mechanical ventilation sounds. The weight of realization was settling over the chamber-like poison gas, slow but inevitable. Then Veltharos began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle that seemed completely inappropriate for the moment, but quickly grew into something more disturbing. His mechanical eyes spun wildly as he threw back his head, the sound echoing off the chamber walls with an almost musical quality that made several delegates flinch.